Considered both the greatest heroes and the greatest villains of the era, which is why they are known both as captains of industry and as robber barons, depending on whether we are mad at them. While they often came from humble origins, took risks, and became very wealthy, their methods were frequently unscrupulous. I mean, they often drove competitors out of business and generally cared very little for their workers. The first of the great robber barons and/or captains of industry was the aforementioned Cornelius Vanderbilt, who rose from humble beginnings in Staten Island to make a fortune in transportation through ferries and shipping, and then eventually through railroads, although he once referred to trains as them things that go on land. But the poster boy of the era was John D. Rockefeller, who started out as a clerk for a Cleveland merchant and eventually became the richest man in the world. Ever. Yes, including Bill Gates. The key to Rockefeller's success was ruthlessly buying up so many rivals that by the late 1880s, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the U.S. oil industry, which lack of competition drove the price of gasoline up to like 12 cents a gallon. So if you had one of the 20 cars in the world, then you were mad. The period also saw innovation in terms of the way industries were organized. Many of the robber barons formed pools and trusts to control prices and limit the negative effects of competition. The problem with competition is that over time it reduces both prices and profit margins, which makes it difficult to become super rich. Vertical integration was another innovation. Firms bought up all aspects of the production process, from raw materials to production to transport and distribution. Like Philip Armour's meat company bought its own rail cars to ship meat, for instance. It also bought things like conveyor belts, and when he found out that animal parts could be used to make glue, he got into the glue-making business. It was Armour who once proclaimed to use everything but the squeal. Horizontal integration was when big firms bought up small ones. The best example of this was Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which eventually became so big, incidentally, that the Supreme Court forced Standard Oil to be broken up into more than a dozen smaller oil companies, which, by the way, over time have slowly reunited to become the company known as ExxonMobil, so that worked out. U.S. Steel was put together by the era's giant of finance, J.P. Morgan, who, at his death, left a fortune of only $68 million, not counting the art that became the backbone of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, leading Andrew Carnegie to remark in surprise, "And to think he was not a rich man." Speaking of people who weren't rich, let us now praise the unsung heroes of industrialization: workers. Well, I guess you can't really call them unsung because Woody Guthrie. Oh, your guitar and my computer. I never made that connection before. Anyway, then as now, the benefits of economic growth were shared, shall we say, a smidge unevenly. Prices did drop due to industrial competition, which raised the standard of living for the average American worker. In fact, it was among the highest in the world. But due to a growing population, particularly of immigrant workers, there was job insecurity, and also booms and busts meant depressions in the 1870s and 1890s, which hit the working poor the hardest. Also, laborers commonly worked 60 hours per week with no pensions or injury compensation, and the U.S. had the highest rate of industrial injuries in the world. An average of over 35,000 people per year died on the job. These conditions and the uncertainty of labor markets led to unions, which were mostly local but occasionally national. The first national union was the Knights of Labor, headed by Terence V. Powderly, which grew from 9 members in 1870 to 728,000 by 1884. The Knights of Labor admitted unskilled workers, black workers, and women, but it was irreparably damaged by the Haymarket Riot in 1886. During a strike against McCormick Harvesting Company, a policeman killed one of the strikers, and in response, there was a rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square at which a bomb killed 7 police officers. Then, firing upon the crowd, the police killed 4 people. 7 anarchists were eventually convicted of the bombing, and although Powderly denounced anarchism, the public still associated the Knights of Labor with violence, and by 1902, its membership had shrunk considerably to 0. The banner of organized labor, however, was picked up by the American Federation of Labor under Samuel L. Gompers. Do all of these guys have great last names? They were more moderate than the anarchists and the Socialist International Workers of the World, and focused on bread and butter issues like pay, hours, and safety. Founded in 1886, the same year as the Haymarket Riot, the AFL had about 250,000 members by 1892, almost 10% of whom were iron and steel workers. And now we have to pause to briefly mention one of the most pernicious innovations of the era, social Darwinism, a perversion of Darwin's theory that would have made him throw up, although to be fair, almost everything made him throw up. Social Darwinists argued that the theory of survival of the fittest should be applied to people, and also that corporations were people. Ergo, big companies were big because they were fitter, and we had nothing to fear from monopolies.
Now, let's get something straight. Darwinism does apply to people, genetically speaking. What he meant to say here is social Darwinism was the application of Darwin's theory to the social world. In other words, let the rich people survive, let the poor people die out, and it will raise the gene pool. This will be covered later on in this presentation.
Pseudoscience was used to argue that government shouldn't regulate business or pass laws to help poor people. It assured the rich that the poor were poor because of some inherent evolutionary flaw, thus enabling tycoons to sleep at night. You know, on a big pile of money surrounded by beautiful women. But despite the apparent inborn unfitness of workers, unions continued to grow and fight for better conditions, sometimes violently. There was violence at the Homestead Steel Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Rail Strike of 1894, when strikers were killed and a great deal of property was destroyed. To quote the historian Michael Lind, in the late 1870s and early 1880s, the United States had 5 times as many unionized workers as Germany, at a time when the two nations had similar populations. Unions wanted the United States and its citizens to imagine freedom more broadly, arguing that without a more equal economic system, America was becoming less, not more free, even as it became more prosperous.
So that was the major argument of the workers, and again, we will get to this throughout the unit. But their argument was the nation is benefiting tremendously from this economic growth, and those at the top are taking the tremendous lion's share of the benefit. Not only that, the amount of money they are getting equals political power, so we are becoming less democratic because of this.
If you're thinking that this freewheeling age of fast growth, uneven gains in prosperity, and corporate heroes/villains resembles the early 21st century, you aren't alone. And it's worth remembering that it was only 150 years ago that modern corporations began to form and that American industry became the leading driver in the global economy. That's a blink of an eye in world history terms, and the ideas and technologies of post-Civil War America gave us the ideas that still define how we, all of us, not just Americans, think about opposites like success and failure, or wealth and poverty. It's also when people began to discuss the ways in which inequality could be the opposite of freedom.
Back to the presentation and on to the second slide. This presentation is more or less organized around 3 essential questions. 1. What were the causes of rapid industrialization? 2. How did it change our social values, political values, and economic values? And 3. How did it change the world of commerce? So we will first look at the first question. What were the causes of rapid industrialization? But before I do, I'd like to look at a chart that gives us some indicators of economic change. So first, let's look at number of farms and farmland from 1870 to 1920. So if you look, the number of farms actually increases from 1870 to 1920, from 2.7 million to 5.7 million to 6.4 million. And even millions of acres increases from 408 million acres to 841 million acres to 956 million acres. And that may seem counterintuitive. If we're claiming that manufacturing was taking over for agriculture, how could that be? And the answer lies in the fact that the western expansion, the frontier was becoming settled. We were giving out homesteads. So, and it was concurrent with immigration from southern and eastern Europe, and they were settling in the cities. So farms were expanding at the same time, and at a greater rate, a much greater rate, manufacturing was expanding on the East Coast. So if you look at employment from 1870 to 1920, just flat out employment, uncategorized, we had 14 million employed people in 1870. That doubled to 28.5 million by 1900, and almost doubled again to 44.5 million by 1920. Our population was increasing. If you look at the manufacturing jobs, in the millions. In 1870, we had 2.5 million manufacturing jobs. By 1900, we have 5.9 million. By 1920, 11.2 million manufacturing jobs. On the flip side, if you look at agriculture as a percentage in the workforce, it goes from 52% in 1870, more than half, to 27%, about a quarter of all jobs by 1920. Again, on the flip side of that, if you look at industry or manufacturing, or industry, if you look at the legend on the bottom there, includes manufacturing, transportation, mining, and construction. Went from 29% in 1870 to 44% by 1920. So those are some major economic changes. On the same token, if you go down to the GNP, the gross national product, how much we were able to manufacture as a nation, we went from $371 billion in 1870 to $920 billion by 1920. Now that is a tremendous increase in manufacturing. So, let's look at the causes of rapid industrialization. Number one, we have the steam revolution of the 1830s to 1850s. Number two, the railroads. The railroad fueled the growing U.S. economy. They were the first big business in the United States. They were a magnet for financial investment, and they were the key to opening the West. Railroads would go from New York City to Chicago, and they would splinter out from Chicago to their hinterland in the West. Hinterland being literally the land they were able to reach with their products via the railroads. Hinterland, it was called. And they also would aid the development of other industries. You could manufacture your product and sell them further away because of the railroads. So railroads enabled the second industrial revolution. Private investment and huge grants of land and money by the federal, the state, and local governments tripled the number of miles of rail between 1860 and 1880, and tripled it again over the next 40 years. This opened vast new areas to commercial farming and created a national market for manufactured goods. By the 1890s, 5 transcontinental railroad lines, meaning from coast to coast, carried western mine, farm, ranch, and forest products to markets in the East, which in turn made factory goods for the West. Railroads were so critical to economic growth and the national market that financial crises in the rail industry directly shocked the entire national economy. Today we would know that as too big to fail. An expanding population became an ever larger market for mass production, mass distribution, and mass marketing of goods, advertising, all of which are the basis of a modern industrial economy. Again, this is the era in which we became modern America. National brands, national stores, and mail order firms such as Sears, Roebuck and Company emerged for the first time. And this is a chart showing you